Yeah, so Roman Leicester, and perhaps why Roman Leicester in terms of a talk for people who aren't in Leicester. So hopefully by the end of this you'll get an appreciation of what life was like in Roman Britain through the excavation of one city. And Leicester, on the surface, is perhaps not the most obvious choice of city to study, although when you look at its name, Leicester, the Cester bit in it tells you it was a Roman city. But today, no one really thinks of Leicester as a historic city. They think of it as a Victorian city, an industrial city. And that's because not a lot of its history and its heritage survives above ground anymore. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have archaeology that takes us back over 2,000 years of continuous occupation in the city. So why study Roman Leicester? Well, we've actually been studying it since really antiquarians started studying Roman Britain from the beginning in the 17th century. This mosaic found on Leicester's High Street was actually one of the earliest recorded mosaics in Britain, one of the very first discovered Roman mosaics. It's a little octagonal panel. It's a couple of foot across, and it shows two figures and a stag. And when it was originally found in around about 1675, it was interpreted as the story of Actaeon being turned into a stag by Artemis. And others suggested it might have been Hercules and the Cerenaean hind. But today it's thought to be a representation of the story of Cyparissus, who was accidentally killed his pet stag and in his grief turned into a cypress tree, which was a traditional, cypress was a traditional symbol of mourning in the Roman Empire. And so what we have here is we can see Cyparissus caressing his pet stag, and his love for his stag and the stag's ultimate death is sort of represented by Cupid drawing his bow. This is the only known reference to Cyparissus in Roman Britain. And what it's actually showing, this is actually showing a scene from Ovid's Metamorphosis. So what this is actually showing is a Roman Briton who has an appreciation of classical Roman literature and is displaying that appreciation through a mosaic pavement in the floor of one of the rooms in their townhouse. So we can't think of Roman Leicester as a backwater town. We can't think of Roman Britain as sort of right on the edge of the Roman Empire and therefore not fully integrated. The more we excavate across Britain, the more we appreciate that Roman Britons, indigenous Iron Age people that have become Romans, had a full appreciation and understanding and were fully incorporated and enfranchised within that wider classical Roman Empire. The other reason to study Roman Leicester, well, we have one of the largest fragments of Roman buildings still surviving above the ground. This large fragment is the Jury Wall, which is a remains part of the Roman baths in Leicester, and I'll come back to that later. So it's the largest piece of non-military Roman stonework still standing in Britain. So there are Roman forts that have more masonry, but it's the only bit of public architecture, or the largest bit of public architecture to survive. So whilst Leicester is a Victorian city and has largely lost a lot of its sort of medieval buildings, still slap bang in the middle of the town centre, there is this huge bit of Roman wall that is very visible to everybody that walks past it. So before I start, I think perhaps I should set Leicester into the context of towns within Roman Britain. So by the time, say, after 50 years of Roman occupation, so the beginning of the 2nd century AD, Britain is now starting to be quite well incorporated in the Roman Empire, and its network of roads links multiple cities across the province. And they broadly fall into 3 categories. So at the top, we have what are called colonia. These are Roman colonies. These are absolutely impositions on the British landscape, settled by Romans, not by Britons. And these would have contained Roman soldiers, Roman citizens, mostly retired veterans. The first colonia was at Colchester, and then later further colonia was set up at Lincoln, at Gloucester, and later on in the Roman Empire, the Roman period towards the end of it, in York as well. Beneath that category then you have the towns of the indigenous population, and at the top of that category is the municipa, the provincial cities. This is the principal city in the province, and unsurprisingly that's London in Britain. But London was not an Iron Age town. It was founded entirely by the Romans, but was founded by Romano-British people, but during the Roman period, and rises to be the preeminent trading and administrative centre of the province. And then beneath that, all the rest of the cities are what we call civitas capitals. So these are the regional cities that pretty much do what those cities do today. They're county towns, effectively. This is the beginning of why Leicester is the county town for Leicestershire, and why Dorchester is the county town for Dorset, and so forth. It was because they were the Roman cities that represented the regional administrative centre for a group of people, a tribal group of people within that area, effectively. So when we study Roman towns, really the bulk of what we're studying are these civitas capitals, because they make up the bulk of the settlements. And then beneath civitas capitals, you get the hundreds of small towns, roadside settlements, settlements that have grown up outside Roman forts, farms, villas, etc. But we're going to focus on one city, Leicester, and how that influences, what that tells us about the wider Roman Empire. And Leicester is a really good city to study because there are other cities that have been more widely studied. If you look at other Roman cities, Silchester and Wroxeter, for instance, have been very widely excavated. Those are the two on the left. But they've been widely excavated because they no longer exist. They were abandoned in the sort of immediate post-Roman period, and therefore they must be considered atypical as towns because they didn't remain continuously occupied. So studying them, whilst it gives us a very unique insight into Roman towns, doesn't necessarily give us an understanding of why Roman towns survived, because they didn't. If we want to look at Roman towns that survived, we've got to look under town centres today. And if we say looked under the town centre of York or Canterbury or Lincoln, we would find evidence of the Roman cities underneath them. But the problem with those sites is they are still historic cities. They are still narrow streets full of medieval buildings, 17th, 18th, 19th century buildings that don't get knocked down because of their own historical importance, and don't provide a lot of space around them for archaeologists to get deep enough to actually find the Roman city. I mean, if you've been to York and you've been into the crypts of York Minster, you'll realise how deep you've got to go to get to the Roman street, because you end up underneath the Minster in the Forum, and you can see the streets there. So these cities, whilst they are just as Roman as Leicester, don't provide a lot of insights because you just can't get at them. Leicester is unique in this through a quirk of its post-Roman urban development, particularly in the late medieval period. The medieval town, which was basically sitting within the same area as the Roman town, so that yellow dotted line you can see is the line of the Roman town wall, which was the same as the medieval town wall. In the late medieval period, the area in the foreground of the photograph, the northern half of the medieval town, depopulated, largely to do with things like the plague and so forth, and remained unoccupied until really the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century, when it then became covered in a mixture of factories and slum houses, which were then cleared with the post-war urban regeneration in the 1950s and 60s, which put through the massive inner relief road that you can sort of see ripping through the middle of the photograph. And you can actually see here, this is a photograph from 2004. You can see archaeological excavations all over the place. There's about 5 or so in this photograph. There's the big one here. There's one over in the couple in the centre of the photograph and everything. This is all to do with a massive new shopping centre that was being built actually it's longer than I want to think now, to be honest, back in 2004 to 2006. So there's only one tiny little bit, the southeast quarter of the historic town, that is still historic. The rest of it is entirely modern buildings, which have been continuously rebuilt on a sort of, on average, every 30 years or so. They've been knocked down and rebuilt. And so that actually affords us this unique opportunity into a city that's been continuously occupied for 2,000 years, which, when you consider the amount of history that's generated, that's quite an accomplishment. And we now have, from the 1930s through to the present day, and in fact I've been in Leicester today monitoring some excavations, we have now 90 years worth of archaeological excavations from Leicester, which makes Leicester, I think, and no one else has calculated it in any other city, so I can't be certain I'm correct on this, but I'm pretty sure it makes Leicester the most excavated city in Britain, in terms of the area within its historic boundary, its historic defences. Last time we calculated, we'd actually excavated about 12% of the historic city core, which, given that it is continuously occupied to this day, is exceptional. So that gives us a unique insight, not only into the Roman town, but also how the Roman town turned into the modern town as well. And I mean, this is way too much for one talk, which is why we're focusing on the Roman town today. But it's a continuously growing story, effectively. It continues to sort of, modern archaeology is almost, we're starting to look at things from the Second World War in archaeological senses now as well, in the way we record them before they disappear. So let's start at the beginning then. So if we take Leicestershire in the late Iron Age, so in the 1st century BC, so just over 2,000 years ago, Iron Age Leicestershire, as was much of the southern half of Britain, and what I mean by the southern half of Britain, I sort of mean that sort of traditional line from the Humber to the Severn, so everything south of that line, was very well managed landscape. It wasn't a wild place with very few people living in it. It was a heavily managed agrarian and pastoral landscape. The bulk of the population lived in farmsteads. This is Butser Farm down in Hampshire, the reconstruction farm, and it's very typical of what you'd see in the countryside. You'd see a small cluster of roundhouses containing a extended family group surrounded by its farmland, well cultivated farmland, and then on the peripheries of the farm you'd perhaps get a little bit of more wilder common, some woodland, and then you'd get the next farm. So you'd get sort of fields surrounding the farm itself, and then shared resources in between. But you also, by the late Iron Age, start to get slightly more aggregated settlements, what we would start considering as proto-urban towns. And one of those was at Leicester. So the way the Romans viewed Britain when they arrived, they divided the country up. If you look at the map down in the sort of the bottom left, you can see these are the tribes of Britain as described by the Romans. So that's not necessarily true to how the Britons themselves thought of themselves. And so Leicester comes within this tribal area that the Romans called the Tavi, which pretty much covered what is the East Midlands today. So Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire, bits of Derbyshire, bits of Warwickshire, bits of Northamptonshire, and so on. But from our understanding of the Tavi through archaeological excavations, they weren't a single group of people. They were perhaps a confederacy of smaller kingdoms that came together under a sort of a heading of the Tavi. And we know that because we have Iron Age coins that have multiple kings on them, suggesting that there's more than one king of the Tavi at the same time, suggesting there's different groups of them. And we think one of these groups, this southern Tavi group, royal centre was Leicester. And so in the beginning, sort of in the mid 1st century BC, Leicester itself started developing as the Iron Age people would consider it a town, I suspect. Something we might call it an oppidum. It's not a defended structure like a hill fort, although it probably did have a bank and ditch and palisade around it. It covered about 10 hectares along the edge of the River Soar. And from our excavations, this is all very fragmentary evidence because it's at the very bottom of the archaeological sequence. It's had 2,000 years of people digging through it. But we find evidence for roundhouses, we find evidence for ditched enclosures, we find evidence for pits that have got all the refuse thrown in them, etc. What we also find is these, what are called flan trays. These are clay molds with little circular impressions in them that would take a fixed amount of weight of metal that would then be melted to create pellets for minting coins. And the two coins you can see here are two typical Coraltavi coins. So we've got evidence of Leicester having a mint in the late Iron Age, and a mint is in the Iron Age is almost certainly associated with a royal site, hence why we think Leicester was probably one of these centres of a kingdom of the Coraltavi. What we also have is Roman pottery from before the time of the Romans occupying Britain. So we get from Iron Age Leicester high quality early pottery imports from Gaul, from Italy, so France, from Italy, and from Spain itself. So we're seeing a royal centre that is developing into a urban space that has got links not only across Britain but with continental Europe as well. So this isn't an isolated settlement by any means. This is a settlement that is already familiar with aspects of the Roman Empire, even before the Romans arrive. So when we look at where Leicester is in the landscape, we can start to appreciate why it's here. So Leicestershire is divided effectively. You've got, this is looking south just to trip you up, but you've got this large area of hills that we call High Leicestershire, which is sort of the heavy claylands. It's large rolling landscape, deep valleys, lots of river courses. And then on the other side of the Leicester, we've got what we call the Charnwood Hills, which is a wild, much wilder area, much more akin to the Peak District. And it's because it's volcanic rock, very deep valleys, very heavily forested, even to this day. And Leicester forms these, the county is then between these high ground is bisected by the River Soar, which flows north from Leicestershire out and joins the Trent, which then connects with the Humber and flows out into the North Sea. We don't think, though, that even in the Roman period, the River Soar was ever navigable up to Leicester, though. The river valley is very flat, very broad, and the river was very marshy and shallow and tended to cut through lots of abraded channels and was constantly changing. And so would have probably been quite tricky to cross, except where Leicester is. So the original town of Leicester, the sort of little black dot in the centre, which says Rate Coriol Tavorum, sits on a spur of high ground that projects into the valley very close to the river. And at this point, the river valley bottlenecks and forces the river past a couple of gravel islands that seem to have been good enough to either have bridged or forded at this point. Whereas to the north and south, the river frequently flooded up till it was sort of canalised in the 19th century. So very wet valley floor. So it was a perfect crossing point in the Iron Age and probably throughout prehistory that then attracted a settlement where you can, a settlement controlling a river crossing, of course, controls the trade going across it and communication going across it and people moving through the area. Just to show you how big Leicester's grown, the yellow area is the modern city boundary. So when the Romans arrive and first land in Kent in AD 43, so this is the Emperor Claudius's invasion, not Caesar's invasion, that's AD 44 BC. So when the Romans arrive and stay is AD 43, and you get 4 legions land and make their way north. And initially they conquer the southern and eastern kingdoms of the Canti, the Regni, the Atrebates, the Catavalorni, the Trinovantes, etc., and end up conquering Colchester. And from Colchester, they then set up a colonia, so the first Roman town in Britain, and from there the legions start spreading out through the rest of the province, the rest of the island. So you get the Second Legion heading down into Dorset and conquering southern England. You get the 20th Legion moving directly westwards towards the Welsh border. And then from our story, we get the 14th Legion marching sort of northwest through Leicestershire, and the 9th Legion marching directly north towards Lincoln. So because of the way Roman armies march, of course, you've got to have a series of camps and forts along the way. And so we know there is a series of forts in mostly on the edge of Leicestershire. There's one in Rutland, which would have been a fort of the 9th Legion before it ended up in Lincoln. There's one, just annoyingly from my point of view, over the border in Northamptonshire, a marching camp at a place called Weston by Welland that we've done some little bits of excavation for. We know it's a Roman marching camp. From that marching camp, it's 13 miles to Leicester, where we have no evidence of a Roman fort. And then it's 13 miles to Manchester on the Warwickshire border, where there is definitely a Roman fort. So the suggestion is that there should be some sort of military site in Leicester. It's exactly a day's march between two other forts, basically. Trying to find that is tricky. What we find is that the early settlement at Leicester probably didn't change significantly from the existing Iron Age town. It was still in the same place. So all the red dots represent the Iron Age activity we have in Leicester, and all the blue dots represent the very first Roman activity in Leicester, and it basically sits on top of each other. It's more like the indigenous town and people just carried on as normal, that the Roman conquest had very little impact on their daily lives other than the more frequent incorporation of Roman material culture. So Roman pottery, we start to see rectangular buildings becoming more common rather than circular ones. But actually rectangular buildings weren't uncommon in Iron Age Britain. They just preferred circular buildings, but they knew how to build rectangular buildings. We also do get some evidence for Roman soldiers. There is, we think, a little fortlet guarding the river crossing. And we do find things like, it doesn't necessarily look the most exciting object. It's just a little bit of stamped copper alloy sheet. But it's the end, the terminal of a military armband that would have been awarded to a veteran of the conquest. It's an award for bravery, effectively. And this one is snapped off and has been lost. So this is showing that there was a veteran of the Roman conquest. A Roman soldier has been in Leicester at some point. And it appears in an area, it's called an armelia, and it appears in an area between two areas of Iron Age activity. And we do wonder if there's an increasing number of military objects coming out. They're random discoveries at the minute, but there are all these little stars represent military objects. The blue stars represent military objects. And there's more that I haven't had time to add to this map yet, but a lot of them are coming out of this empty bit between the main settlement and this sort of secondary settlement off to the east. And that is the perfect size for a Roman fort. So I have a growing suspicion there is a Roman fort in Leicester on the edge of the main settlement. But I think the main thing with the southern Coral Tarvi is they seem to have accepted the Romans peacefully. And that's why we see very little change. They have surrendered to the Romans peacefully, and therefore the Romans have set them up as a client state and allowed them to carry on governing themselves. Whereas in contrast, the northern Coral Tarvi, focused around Lincoln, get a massive legionary fortress slapped right on top of their Iron Age site, which then becomes a Roman colony. So it might well be that the northern Coral Tarvi were more resistant to Roman occupation than the southern Coral Tarvi, which also might suggest a reason why Leicester then became designated as the regional capital for the entire Coral Tarvi group eventually, and goes on to become known as Ratae Coriol Tavorum. So Ratae is the Roman word used to describe the original Iron Age settlement. It seems to come from a Celtic word meaning ramparts, suggesting the settlement was defended. And Coriol Tavorum is recognizing that it is the city of the Coriol Tarvi, basically. It is identifying it as a civitas capital. We have one other really nice military find, which could be lost from a Roman soldier or could have been given as a gift to an important Iron Age official, and that is it's a cheek piece off a Roman cavalry helmet, which, so this is a good replica on the left of what this helmet would look like, and we have the sort of most of the right hand cheek piece. So you've got this wonderful molded ear, and on the cheek piece itself you've got a winged figure, and this is the winged figure of victory. So it's a sort of double meaning in the message. If you're giving it as a gift, it's sort of, you're giving them this amazing Roman military object with all of this symbols of Roman victory all over it. So it's sort of a loaded symbol, if you will. Within this early sort of setting then, we actually have our first evidence of a Roman in Leicester, a Romano-British person by name. We have a story of a man from Leicester called Novantico, who was the son of, his father was called Adca Bravatis, and he joined the Roman army. So he would have joined the Roman army probably in around about AD 85, so only sort of 40 odd years after the Roman conquest of Britain. Early enough that his father potentially could have remembered the Roman conquest, or certainly his grandparents would have remembered it. So he joined the first, what was called the first Ulpian cohort of Britain. So he wasn't a Roman citizen, he was an Iron Age Briton who joined what was known as an auxiliary unit of soldiers. So these were the soldiers drawn from the wider Roman Empire that weren't Roman citizens. So they weren't legionaries, the sort of the classic Hollywood image of a Roman soldier. These were the sort of the workhorse bit of the army, really, rather than the shock troops. So he would have been an infantryman within this auxiliary unit. And he travelled 1,000 miles, his unit transferred shortly after he joined in AD 85 to a fort on the Danube called Vitus Salina, which is in Hungary today, to guard the Danube frontier. And this was the practice in the Roman period. You didn't keep your auxiliary troops guarding the province they came from. You moved them to guard another part of the empire, so that your Roman soldiers that you were training, your indigenous soldiers that you were training, didn't have the skills to then remove their home province from the Roman Empire, effectively. It's a way of stopping insurrection growing in the county. And then that unit then moved down into northern Macedonia and then took part in the Emperor Trajan's Dacian Wars, his conquest of the kingdom of Dacia, crossed the Danube and moved up into Romania, basically, and ended up at the Roman fort of Porolisium in northern Romania. And we know all of this because of this bronze plaque, which is Novantico's discharge papers from the Roman army. So we actually have his story told, his biography told on this plaque. And we know in AD 106 then that his entire unit was awarded, all the surviving members of his unit were awarded for bravery by given Roman citizenship early. So when someone joined the auxiliary units, they signed up to serve for 25 years. At the end of their service, if they'd survived, they would be made a Roman citizen as a reward for their service, and they'd be given land to go with that. So this shows just how well this unit fought. They were actually granted their Roman citizenship early in recognition of their bravery, amongst other honorary titles that the unit got as well. And in honor of that, Novantico takes the emperor's first names as his own to mark the occasion. So he becomes Marcus Ulpius Novantico. And he was honorably discharged in AD 110. So 4 years after he was made a Roman citizen, he completed his 25 years of service and retired. And we know all of this because the discharge paper was found here. This is the Roman fort of Porolisium. It was found in 1939, the discharge paper. And we presume, as it was found in Porolisium, that Novantico never returned home, that he retired here in northern Romania, that he probably stayed in the settlement outside the fort, or was given land nearby. So he's an expat Leicester, ex-soldier living in Romania. And the nice twist on this story from another document that we have is that about 26 years after Novantico's retirement, another soldier joins his unit. And he was called Marcus Ulpius, son of Ulpius Novantico. and he's almost certainly the second generation of soldiers from Leicester. He's almost certainly Novantico's son, joining his father's old unit. So he's a second generation Leicester Iron Age lad living in Romania, basically. So there's a nice story, but this is the first person we can actually put a name to and a biography to. And this was someone who was living in Leicester just after the Roman conquest of Britain. If we go back to Leicester, though, we start to see, when we look at sort of Leicester in terms of the wider Roman province, we start to see why it was such an important town. So when you look at the road networks, Leicester, if you want to go northwest to southeast, north, south, east, west, you pretty much have to go through Leicester. If you're traveling anywhere in one of the major Roman routes through Leicester, you've got through the province, you've got to go through Leicester. If you're coming up from Dover, for instance, you're going through London, you'd be going up Watling Street. And if you wanted to then get to the eastern side of the Hadrian's Wall, or Lincoln or York, you'd then have to go through Leicester and up the Fosse Way to Lincoln, and then up Ermine Street up north. If you wanted to carry on over to the Welsh border, you'd have to carry on Watling Street. You might divert to Leicester. If you're coming from Colchester, you'd definitely have to go through Leicester to get to Chester or Wroxeter or one of the many other places. So pretty much everything had to go through Leicester, which must have made it quite an important trade centre in terms of the wider province. And so in about AD 100, so sort of, it's a little tricky to pin down exact dates on these sorts of things through archaeology, but the turn of the 2nd century, we see Leicester refounded from its Iron Age town into this Roman civitas capital. So it gets specifically designated as a regional administrative centre and given the name Ratae Coel Tavorum. And to mark that, the Iron Age town is swept away and a new planned town is laid out with a rectangular street grid, with certain areas of the town designated for public buildings and other areas designated for all the other things that go on in towns, domestic spaces, industrial spaces, shops, etc., temples. But what's important here to understand is that at this point in time, Leicester wasn't a defended settlement. It was an open town. And actually the street grid is far more ambitious probably than the number of residents living in it. And from our understanding of the street grid, it was never fully occupied. Even by the end of the Roman period, certain areas were never fully occupied or densely occupied. And so what happens was there was this phase of urban planning that dug lots of ditches to mark out all of these insula, the city blocks. The streets were then allowed to turf back over, the ditches silting in, and it almost started to disappear. And only streets that were actually in use were gravelled. But as more and more streets came into use, more and more of them were gravelled, and we get these really compacted gravel cambered streets through Leicester. They're so compacted you don't see wheel ruts in them. They're so compacted diggers actually have trouble digging through them today. They're these really densely compacted gravelled cambered surfaces. They've got a little bit of iron in the sand which concretes them into almost something like concrete. And what you can see on the top left is all the constant resurfacings of the Roman street through 300 years of history. So the original layer at the bottom is the original turf line. And then you've got the original cambered Roman street there, and then resurfaces. So the Roman roads, they never seem to have taken away the original gravels and put new ones down. They just carried on building it up. So the roads got higher and higher and higher. And they were actually, by the time of the end of the Roman town, in the centre of the town, the roads were higher than the pavements in the forum, and silt was washing off the roads into the rooms and the shops. So it must have been a bit of a nightmare. You'd have had to have stepped down off the streets onto the pavements effectively. So you'd have had to have stepped into the gutters by the end of it. Now, we've been very fortunate with our excavations in Leicester, and I'm going to keep returning to one particular one through the talk because it gave us this amazing insight into the corner of one particular city block. And within that city block, I think, if I remember rightly, we've excavated over 16 Roman buildings from it in their entirety. So this is called Insula 5. The excavation was called Vine Street, if I slip into calling it Vine Street. Today it is the delightful multi-storey car park for John Lewis in the town. But we fully excavated the footprint of the car park in a huge excavation that had over 50 archaeologists working on it, over 100,000 artifacts recovered from it. A huge excavation that took us, explored not only the Roman area of the town, but also the medieval area, all the way back to the Iron Age as well. So we had a huge amount of information from this site, and we were able to chart its progress through time, basically. So what we were able to determine then was that the first the early development of Leicester, soon after the street grid was laid out, was perhaps a bit of a Wild West boomtown vibe. It seems to be where development took place, it was very rapid and all timber buildings, sort of shooting up all over the place. And so in the corner of this insula, we get a whole series of large rectangular buildings that we presume are houses, all enclosed within a timbered, surrounded by yards, enclosed by timber fences. But on the whole, it's on the periphery of the street grid, and it actually has more in sort of common, perhaps, with a rural farm than it does with an urban crossroads, sort of an urban quarter. We have evidence of pig farming, we have evidence of cattle farming, the wooden fences seem to surround fields, and it's looking outward to the countryside rather than really into an urban space. There's no other buildings around it. None of the other city blocks around it seem to have densely populated areas. And so it seems to be, whilst there's this huge street grid that perhaps covers 50 hectares, occupation of it is quite patchy initially, and perhaps only lasts about 50 odd years with these timber buildings before they're swept away and more permanent structures start to build. So it has this it does really have this sort of boomtown vibe initially, but perhaps slightly overstretched. That said, in other parts of Leicester, we are starting to get what we could identify as Roman buildings of the type that you see in places like Pompeii. So very close to the centre of the town, in the more sort of the older Iron Age area, we start to get large townhouses built on a definite Roman Mediterranean style, where you've got ranges of rooms all linked by a colonnaded corridor, peristyle, all surrounding an enclosed central courtyard. So this is the Blue Boar Lane townhouse in Leicester. We have a sequence of 7 rooms from the excavation. It would have been probably, well, it's only one sort of half of the building effectively. Surrounding this central courtyard. The House of the Vetti at Pompeii gives you a really good idea of what it might have looked like. The rooms all have mosaic floors. The walls have all got painted wall plaster, frescoes effectively, and some of that was recovered. And these are the wall paintings from the townhouse, the ones that were you able to recover and reconstruct, which I have to say are quite ghastly in many respects. I think the Romans did not have good taste in wall decoration, I find. Very heavy, dark colours, which I think would have made it quite gloomy. But you've got these big red panels that have got sort of swags of foliage on them and human figures within them. And then on the bottom, you've got a sort of fake marbling trompe-l'oeil effect, which is sort of creating fake shrines, we think, within the frieze. And then they've got foliage in them with little birds painted on them. So it's incredibly intricate. You've got sort of the fake architecture perspective things going on. You've got things like dolphins, you've got theatrical masks. It's a very Roman wall plaster. It's the sort of thing you could quite easily see in Pompeii or anywhere in Italy. Very, whilst ghastly, very highly accomplished as well. You've got a little figure of a god, perhaps, in this shrine. What I like, though, is that after the house fell out of use, it was used as a workshop for horn cores, for horn processing, and the workmen in the workshop started graffitiing the wall plaster. You can see some of the little bits we've translated. There's some of it is quite rude. Some of it is stating the obvious. Someone had written peacock next to one of the birds, for instance, just presumably to make the point that and who knows why Civilis was in confinement or what Civilis had done. But anyway, so again, nice little human touches within this sort of incredible wall plaster. We also have in Leicester, these early townhouses have some incredible geometric mosaics. These are from a selection of townhouses, all of early 2nd century date. And they are of the highest quality that you find in Roman Britain. And there's so many of them that we're starting to suspect that there was probably a mosaic workshop based in Leicester providing mosaics for the town and the wider countryside, as they all use geometric patterns that are all very similar. This is the finest. This is called the Blackfriars pavement. It's generally considered one of the finest mosaics in Britain because of the complexity of the mathematical precision in the geometry of it. But we also have the Peacock pavement, named after the peacock that was in its central circle. And these are large mosaics. These are easily sort of 6 meters by 6 meters with probably over 1 million stone squares in them. Would have taken years potentially to make, and are incredibly sophisticated in terms of the patterns and the knotwork and so forth. One thing that, and this is the other reason why the Cyparissus pavement is so unusual in Leicester, is the only mosaic from Leicester that actually shows human figures. It seems to be the workshop in Leicester favoured geometric patterns over human figures. And you sort of see that with the various workshops across Roman Britain. They all seem to have had their own specialities, presumably based on the original master mosaicist's preference. So presumably this individual preferred geometric patterns, whereas someone else would have preferred mythological scenes, and someone else would have preferred lots of marine wildlife and animals and things like that. So you get these different sort of trends across the sort of regional trends. Now, Leicester is a little bit of a late starter in terms of its public buildings. So whilst we start getting, in the early 2nd century, we get a brand new street grid, we start getting very obvious Roman style buildings and all those sort of trappings of Roman domestic life that would go with them. It's not really until the mid 2nd century, so over a sort of about 100 years after the Roman conquest, that they actually start building, or at least finish, buildings like the Forum, so that the centre of town, the sort of the administrative centre of the town, the public baths, and so forth. And it might have been, we know the Emperor Hadrian visited Britain in AD 122, which is when he decides to build a wall sort of blocking off Scotland. And it might be that it was his visit specifically to the province that was the stimulus for the building of the public works in Leicester. It's certainly, the public buildings aren't earlier than the sort of 120s at any rate. And so the first one to be built is the Forum and Basilica. So you've got the a large basilican building, so a nave and 2 aisles, which would contain all the magistrate functions of the town and the town, sort of the town government apparatus. And then on one side of it, you would have a large enclosed piazza with colonnades of shops surrounding it, which would act as a marketplace and shopping centre. So this is the very heart of every Roman town. Wherever you are in the Roman world, you would find a forum and basilica. We've excavated bits of this in the 1960s and 1970s, which is what this reconstruction is based on. But in reality, we've not excavated enough of this to really say that this is an accurate picture. And we've got some reasonable ideas of its scale. It's 130 meters by 90 meters, so it's bigger than most modern football pitches, basically. And the basilica, from its size, would be probably the equivalent of a 4-story building to the top of its roof. So these are big structures where you bear in mind everything else in Leicester probably wasn't more than 2 stories. This would have stood proud and would have been very visible from a distance as well. It's a big statement of Romanness, effectively, within the town centre. And so this is worth sort of explaining how the town would have worked then at this point. So The Romans in Roman Leicester would, as in people from Rome, from the Roman Empire, from beyond Britain, would have actually been in the minority. There would have probably been a small military community based in the town, acting as a sort of a garrison, probably taxing traffic across the river, providing a little bit of official bureaucracy for the province, maybe a few retired soldiers and a few immigrants that have sort of settled there as well. But the bulk of the residents in the Roman town would have been the Roman British, indigenous British people. And it would have been ruled as an oligarchy. So you would have had a ruling elite, what's called the curial class, which would have probably made up less than 1% of the population, actually providing what are called the curiales, the town councillors, from whom were elected the actual officials, the decurions and the aediles, the elected magistrates who actually were responsible for the day-to-day functioning of the town. Roman citizens would have actually been in the minority at the beginning of this. So in the sort of the late 1st and 2nd century, there would have been probably very few actual Roman citizens, as in recognized by Rome as a citizen of Rome. Most people would have been what are called peregrini, which are free provincial subjects, basically. So they don't have the rights of a full citizen in terms of things like elections and so forth, but they're not slaves, they're not enslaved in any way. They are free subjects, free to move around and live their lives according to how they want to. And so that they would have been that sort of free middle class of merchants, skilled craftsmen, the free working class of craftspeople, shopkeepers, labourers, etc. Would have included foreigners, immigrants, traders that were moving through the province, and would have included free slaves as well. And eventually, though, at the beginning of the 3rd century, the Emperor Caracalla actually extended the franchise of Roman citizenship across the entire Roman Empire. So it sort of only was in the first 150 years of Roman Britain that this was an issue. After AD 212, everybody was a Roman citizen, regardless of where they were born. And we have to remember that Iron Age Britain and Roman Britain were slave-owning societies. So about 10 to 25% of the population of Roman Leicester were probably enslaved in some fashion. And we think at its height, Leicester probably had a population. It's really tricky to actually calculate these things, but 6,000 people would probably be a fair indication of how many people were living in Leicester at its peak. But with these calculations, that's entirely dependent on how densely populated the town is. It could have been as high as 15,000 or as few as 3,000 or something. These are very hard calculations to come up with. There's no sort of satisfactory way of doing it. Lots of people come up with different sort of ways of doing it and wildly different figures. But 6,000 seems to be reasonable. We know at the beginning of the Domesday Book, the Norman Conquest, medieval Leicester had about 3,000 people as listed in the Domesday Book, and Roman Leicester was a bigger town than the medieval town at that point. So 6,000 seems reasonable. We also have, right next to the forum, we have the Roman baths. This is the jury wall that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. And this was the very first bit of Roman Leicester ever to be excavated. This was a seminal excavation in Leicester in the 1930s by Dame Kathleen Kenyon, who went on to become very famous for Middle Eastern archaeology, excavating places like Jericho and so forth in Palestine and other places. But at the beginning of her career, she was excavating a lot of British archaeology. She was a protege of Mortimer Wheeler. And this was her first independent excavation, and she spent 4 years excavating what she thought was going to be the forum at the time, but later turned out to be the town's public baths. And actually, British archaeology, or British commercial archaeology at least, owes a huge amount to Kathleen Kenyon. Effectively, this excavation of hers in Leicester was the very first commercial excavation in the country, carried out. Ironically, the city corporation wanted to build a new municipal swimming pool on the site, had bought the site, knocked the factory down and planned to build a new swimming pool. There was a big outcry because of the standing Roman wall that everybody knew about, and there was the insistence that there was an excavation. And the first year of the excavation was funded by funds raised by local archaeology societies. And it found so much archaeology that there was actually a court case, and the town corporation was ordered to pay for the following 5 years of excavation, which made it the first commercial dig and rescue dig in British history, effectively, 50 odd years before it became protected within planning laws. So we owe a huge amount to Kathleen Kenyon's excavation, and she was an incredible archaeologist as well. I mean, the work was really high quality. We can still get a huge amount of information from what she discovered, and it's still laid out today as a historic monument. They never did build the swimming pool that they wanted to. They had to find a new location. So we know then that the jury wall is the west wall of the basilica that would have held the pilastra of the bars, which is the gymnasium. So Roman bars are a bit like a cross between a Turkish bath and a community centre and a swimming pool and a library, and everything sort of rolled into one. So you wouldn't just come to get clean, you'd come to socialise, you'd come to exercise, you'd have a gymnasium, it'd be a place to meet, to get something to eat, to perhaps read, etc., and also to bathe as well. And so you have lots of different spaces around the bars. But the main area is the swimming area itself, which is usually divided into three main areas. You get the tepidarium, the frigidarium, and the caldarium. So the frigidarium is the cold room, the tepidarium is the warm room, and the caldarium is the hot room. And the hot room is like a sauna, effectively, and you go from hot to cold in your bathing. So you end up jumping in a cold pool of water, basically. You sweat out everything, you clean yourself, you cover yourself in oil and scrape it off. You socialise in the warm pool, and then at the end of it, to be honest, this bath, it doesn't seem to have a cold pool. I have a suspicion they maybe just chucked cold buckets of water at you at the end of it, but it definitely has a cold room. It may have even been an outdoor space. But it's the same as a Turkish bath today, effectively. Turkish baths are an evolution of Roman bathing practices that survived. We also have evidence of temples and religious worship in Leicester, and the interesting thing with this is it's almost entirely Roman worship, even in a British town. We've got very few clues to indigenous gods in Roman Leicester. So we have one temple that we know of for certain. It's a Mithraeum, so it's dedicated to the Persian god Mithras. It was a cult very popular with the Roman army and traders, and so perhaps got introduced to Leicester with people moving through from the wider Roman Empire. Excuse me. But whilst we don't actually have any other temples in Leicester, we do have lots of everyday objects that show the diversity of gods present in the town. So we've got everything from, we've got a melted silver ring with an intaglio on it that shows the god Mars, for instance. We've got part of a little ceramic figurine that is a Venus figurine. So this was possibly, they were mass produced. Would look a bit like the Venus de Milo, the sort of typical Venus pose with the long hair and sort of clothes just sort of emerging from bathing sort of look. Was probably mass produced and would have been bought as a shrine object to perhaps have either to give as a votive offering or to have in a household shrine. This little gold relief shows the god Vulcan, and you can see his sort of hammer and tongs. He's holding his hammer and tongs. The bone handle off a folding knife that shows the god Pan on it with his pan pipes. And we even have the Egyptian god Anubis depicted on an object from Leicester, which is really unusual. In fact, the Anubis, it's probably Leicester's example, is the most northernly known representation of Anubis. It's a little ivory panel. It's about 5 centimeters high, and on it we can see a crouching dog sort of rearing up on its hind legs and holding a lance. And he's sort of crouched in foliage that has been interpreted as lotus leaves. It's very similar pose to this image we see on an Egyptian catacomb of Anubis dressed as a Roman soldier. Anubis in the Roman Empire seems to have been very popular amongst soldiers in the Roman army, particularly, so that a lot of Egyptians joined the Roman army, and so it sort of transferred with that. This would have been a little panel off a relief carved ivory box, and just to get a box like that, the box would have been made in Roman Egypt. It's very unusual to get a box like this, or even just a bit of it, in Western Europe and Britain. It's rare for them to have travelled outside of Egypt. It's also really unusual for it not to have a classical pantheon depicted on it, but an Egyptian pantheon of gods depicted on it. It isn't the only depiction of Anubis we have in Britain, though. There are a collection of oil lamps from a Roman burial in London that show the god Anubis on them as well. And there are a lot of connections. I'll come back to this later. There are a lot of connections between Roman Britain and Roman Leicester and Roman Africa as well. So there's definitely a movement of communication and goods and probably people between those areas of the Roman Empire. Other religious structures, we have some other curious fragments and references to buildings. So we've got a bit of an altar that shows what is probably some sort of ocean sea god like Oceanus on it, described as a sea god because he's wearing a classic Roman fisherman's cap, as sort of that you see in depictions. It may have come off the base of something called a Jupiter column. This fragment of altar was found with a scaled column drum, which oh, sorry, tickle, is quite a unique architectural style that is only usually found on these things they're very uniquely Northern European monumental column called a Jupiter column, which has a figure of Jupiter on the top riding a horse usually, and then lots of other gods depicted around the base. We also have this little lead sheet at the top here is what's called a curse tablet. So it has scratched writing on it. And we can translate this. We know it was written by a man called Sabinianus, who's had some silver coins stolen. And he names 3 culprits, Semillus, Cupitus, and Licita. And he calls a god to strike down in the Septizonium and asks them to lose their life, the thief to lose their life within 7 days, basically. So sort of pre-police structures, you can't necessarily catch the thief, so you call on the gods to punish them instead, and you hope that one of these 3 will drop dead, and then you know who's stashed your silver. Which is another nice little human story, but in this instance, what we're really interested in here is this word of a reference to a septizonium. It's a really curious structure. It seems to be some sort of monumental fountain or building dedicated to the 7 planetary deities that represent the days of the Roman week. So the Saturn, Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, and Venus, which is why the thief wants them to lose their life in 7 days. It's linked with the 7 days of the week. The Septizonian, this is only the 6th known reference to such a building in the entire Roman Empire from Leicester. There's no other reference to such a building in Britain or even in Northern Europe. The most northerly example up to now was one in Rome itself on the Palatine, built by the Emperor Septimus Severus. All the others are in North Africa and Sicily. So having a reference to such a building in Leicester seems really unusual. But we do know, and this may be another link with Leicester, bearing in mind that map where if you're going anywhere through Britain, you've got to go through Leicester. This actually may be a direct link with the Emperor Septimus Severus. He visited Britain. In fact, he died in York. And so he may well have passed, he almost certainly would have had to have passed through Leicester to go north. He led a campaign north to try and conquer Scotland. And for a while, York was the imperial capital of the entire Roman Empire for about 4 years until his death. And so it might be all of these other known Septizonians are linked with Septimus Severus. So it seems likely that ours in Leicester is, and it may be a direct link with a Roman emperor in Britain, which is, if it's true, it's really exciting. It's going to be impossible to prove, but it is a really exciting thing to be able to actually link a Roman emperor's movements through Britain, perhaps with Leicester as well as York. going back to our Insula 5, in the mid to late 2nd century, then the town has started to stabilise and sort of actually form as a town. And so we see all those timber buildings get swept away and start to get replaced by more permanent structures. But it still has that sort of rural vibe about it. There's still, you've got a series of buildings. There's a townhouse, a group of workshops, a bathhouse, another townhouse, more workshops, but they're still very spread out. There's a lot of open ground in between them, probably fields and gardens and orchards and market gardens and stuff. And so on the edge of the town street grid, even in the mid to late 2nd century, so 150 years, 150 years after the arrival of the Romans, Roman Leicester is still not fully developed. It's still got at least on its edges, it's still got this sort of rural vibe about it going on. But these workshops are very typical, these long narrow workshops are very typical of Roman, what the bulk of the Roman buildings in Leicester would have been. They're called strip buildings, and basically they have a very simple internal floor plan. They're divided into 3 rooms, with the middle room sort of usually with a corridor running down the side of it, linking the front and back room. And so the front room would be a workshop and shop, and the back rooms would be the private domestic spaces of the family living in it. And so when we excavate these, we find all sorts of, you know, fire pits containing metalworking waste, so we bone working waste, etc. So we know that there was a lot of craft activities going on in Leicester during the Roman period. We have evidence for pottery making, iron working, bronze working, lead working, glass making, bone working, horn, leather, etc. We can also presume from tools recovered that woodworking and textile making is going on as well. So the full gamut of things that you'd need for a town to sort of support itself are going on in Leicester. We have cellars that would have probably been underneath shops that collect detritus. This particular cellar had lots of lots of amphora and drinking cups broken in the bottom of it, and the speculation is that it might have been the cellar under a tavern, for instance, based on the fines being dropped into it. And sometimes you get these lucky chances during excavations where you don't actually find a lot of archaeology, but the archaeology you do really sort of gives key insights into the town. So this was a tiny little excavation in Leicester. And actually, it didn't really find the Roman buildings themselves. It found a little bit of a Roman street with a colonnaded building running down the side of it. They didn't really get a chance to look at the building itself. The building had been destroyed. But behind the building was a pit, which is this black one in the middle, pit 1067. And from that pit, the archaeologists extracted a huge quantity of material that gives us a real insight into what's going on in Leicester and in this particular shop. So there was a huge amount of broken pottery recovered from the pit, but the type of pottery was quite interesting in its limitations. So there's lots of broken bowls, amphora, jars and flagons. So lots of things for storing and displaying and serving foods in. But there was nothing for eating foods from, so no plates or little bowls. There was no drinking cups or anything like that. There was also a huge amount of food evidence. So you have all of these shoulders of beef are from smoked beef. You can tell because they all have a little hole in the shoulder blade where the hook's gone through that would have hung the beef, the shoulder blade up to smoke. We've got fish bones and scales. We've got fig seeds, grape pips, opium poppies, cherry stones have all survived within the pit and been recovered. And this unique combination of food types and pottery suggests that this isn't a restaurant or an eatery. It's not a place to eat in. It's a place to buy food and take it away. So all the vessels are things for storage and display, not for eating from. So we think effectively this is a Roman delicatessen. And the table you can see on the right shows all the food types that came out of this pit. So we've got everything. We've got olive oil, wine, fish sauce, fruits, so dates probably, grapes and figs. They are all imported foods. You can't grow those in Britain in the Roman period. Indigenous things, we've got apples, we've got cherries or plums, and we've got strawberries. They could all be grown locally. We've got opium poppy seeds. could be grown locally but have to have been imported. They're not indigenous to Britain. We've got wheat, we've got freshwater fish, so that again could be local, but we've also got seafood. So we've got links with the coast bringing seafood to Leicester, which is effectively the most central place in the country you can get. In fact, the centre of England is officially in Leicestershire. So, you'd have to salt it effectively. Or in the terms of oysters, which is a very popular snack food in the Roman period, you'd barrel them up in brine and they'd still be alive as you shipped them, so that they would be fresh when they arrived. We've also got beef, we've got mutton, we've got pork. So it gives, this one pit has given a huge insight into the types of food available in the Roman period in Britain and in Leicester itself. But what we tend to think of when we think of Roman towns, and we sort of look at those sort of classic reconstruction drawings of a Roman town, and we sort of watched Hollywood and TV, and we've read Asterix, and we've got our idea of what Romans are like from all of that sort of popular culture. We're actually talking about all of that stuff tends to be early Roman Britain. So it tends to be talking about really the sort of late first, second century AD. And Roman Britain was really a story of two halves. You've got that sort of classical Roman Britain, that sort of that earlier side, and then the third and fourth centuries, where things start to quite radically change across Britain. And actually, by the end of the Roman period, when you look at what late Romans looked like, they look more like Anglo-Saxons than they would look like Romans of our imagination. So we are talking about a period spanning 350 years here of this story. So by the 3rd century, when Leicester was at its peak, we think this is what it might have looked like: a very well-developed urban space. But actually still quite open. You know, it wasn't tightly developed by any means. There was lots of open spaces in and around it, undeveloped insular or deliberately not developed ones. So, you know, some of these empty spaces might have been things like builders' yards and market spaces and kitchen gardens and stuff, which don't survive archaeologically. But it was no means the dense, packed streets that you quite often see in reconstruction drawings of Roman towns. Those troubles in the later Roman period, in sort of particularly the 3rd century, sort of really from the late 2nd century onwards, made a significant impact on Leicester. So in the late 2nd century, that open urban space, which for 150 years has been very outward looking, changed with the addition of defences around the town. And suddenly, that space where you could literally walk down any street and be out in the countryside with probably no sort of control and taxation, suddenly changed and limited people to just 4 entrance and exit points. So 1 gate on each side of the town. And that must have been a huge impact. The town is now surrounded by 2 ditches and an earth rampart with a timber palisade on it for the defence of the town, and probably for its sort of a status symbol, but also suddenly very, very controlling. And I mean, even the town contracts at this point. Before the defence is built, it probably covered about 50 hectares. When the defences were added, it actually cut an entire southern bit of the town out and contracted it down to about 42 hectares. So actually limited the town. And it's noticeable that after the defences were built, everything outside the town disappeared. All the sort of development, all the buildings that were now outside the defences ceased to exist. They were either deliberately cleared or just couldn't survive outside the town walls anymore. And everything moved inside the town. That timber walls were then replaced with stone walls in the late 3rd or early 4th century. And those stone walls then remained in place into the medieval period and were still in use. When Leicester was besieged in the 12th century, the king's army was undermining the Roman walls to get in the town, not medieval rebuild. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there was a decline in the town. So traditionally, in the end of the later Roman period, the 3rd and 4th centuries are traditionally seen as a period when Roman towns started to decline. And that's been because of excavations at places like Silchester and Wroxeter, which were abandoned in the post-Roman period and therefore were atypical of Roman towns. When we look at Roman Leicester, we see a completely different story appearing. For instance, that space on Insula 5 continued to grow and actually now looks like by the 3rd century had to come under a single ownership who builds a huge courtyard house on the corner. Cleverly links all the existing buildings together by new bits of build and creates this big courtyard house which measures 40 meters by 40 meters, has about 30 rooms in it if it's a single story building, double that if it's 2-story. I mean, we don't know if it had 2 stories. We show it as 1 story usually, but has a huge floor space, but again, very Roman in style. It's a courtyard house with a central courtyard surrounded by ranges of rooms linked by corridors, but it's completely linked together. It's very inward looking. It's sort of very looks in on itself rather than looks outward. Behind it is a large warehouse that was probably owned by the owner of the house. So it's the sort of big industrial, sort of commercial venture and home up in this corner. So it no longer has that sort of outward looking rural feel to it. It now does start to feel like an urban space, although still it is surrounded by large areas of open ground still. That courtyard house then has underfloor heating. It had mosaic floors, sort of tessellated pavements down the corridors, much finer mosaic floors in the reception rooms. It has a very nice central apsidal room, which is probably the dining room at one end, which would have looked through the courtyard towards the entrance to the building. It has drainage within it as well. If you think about all the water coming off the roofs in Britain on a wet day into that central courtyard space, that's a lot of water. And so it actually does have culverts under the courtyard, taking the water out of under the building and out onto the guttering of the street beyond. But it doesn't have ceramic tiles. It has a slate roof from local slates. So they haven't gone to a huge expense of having tiles made for the roof, but it does have painted wall plaster on the walls, very similar to the Blue Boar Lane house. A little bit simpler in taste, a little bit paler in sort of colour schemes, but still probably equally horrible, I suspect. We found some unusual things. We found some perinatal burials buried beneath the entrance hall and beneath the kitchen. These were probably babies that died in childbirth that were kept with the family. So this is quite often found in Roman buildings, that you find babies buried beneath the eaves of the roofs or in rooms that had particular connection with family and sacred space, like the entrance hall or the kitchen. And the hearth space within the houses. It's sort of like keeping perinatal burials. They weren't considered human in the eyes of the law yet. They were, because they weren't named. Roman children weren't named for sort of maybe the first 6 months of their life, and so weren't seen as legally human until they were named. So they sort of fall a bit outside the law in terms of burial in burial grounds, and that's sort of another reason why that you find them buried in the home instead. It's a tradition. Basically, it's a way of adapting to the sort of the legalities of these people and these babies. Again, with such an excavation like this, we get insights into the occupants. And again, we have another curse tablet from Leicester, from this courtyard house, which I have to say is my favourite find, I think, from Roman Leicester. So this is, we call it the Savandus tablet after the name of the aggrieved party. And this is important, this tablet, for a lot of different reasons. But Savandus was basically, he's had his favourite cloak stolen from the slaves' quarters. So he goes, I give to the god Maglus him who did wrong from the slaves' quarters. I give him who did theft the cloak from the slave quarters, who stole the cloak of Savandus. He clearly doesn't have a clue who stole his cloak, because he then lists 19 people. And then he goes, I give the god Maglus before the 9th day, take away him who stole the cloak of Savandus. So he's calling on the god Maglus to punish him. Now, interestingly, considering this is a late 2nd or early 3rd century artifact, Savandus is calling on a British god. Maglus is a Celtic god. He's the only Celtic god we know of from Leicester. And it's a Celtic word that probably just simply means Lord. So he's going Lord, punish. But he's using a Celtic word, which is really interesting. The other interesting thing is it directly mentions slave quarters. The cloak specifically is stolen from the slaves' quarters, which probably means Savandus and all 19 people here are all slaves living in that slaves' quarter. And that's a big group of people, 20 odd people living in a single household. And so our courtyard house is probably the size of house you'd need to have 20 slaves keeping it operational. So this is actually giving voice to the voiceless past, because slaves are one of those groups of people that you rarely actually hear of the voice of in the Roman period, anywhere in the Roman world, really. So this is a unique insight, really, into people you wouldn't otherwise see. The 20 named people, there's 17 men and 3 women on the list. So you've got Vovena, Vendasinia and Nigella, all women. You've got a mixture of Latin, British, Germanic and Greek names on the list as well. So you've got things like Sylvester is a very Latin name. Germanus is obviously very Germanic. Cunavendus is a classically sort of Celtic British name. So you've got this mixture of names. Now, whether that means you've got a mixture of slaves coming from across those areas of the empire, or whether you've got names coming from across those areas of the empire, we don't know. But it shows movement of communication, at the very least, in that names in other parts of the empire have become popular in Britain, if they're not representing people that have come from those areas. I like this in particular because the last name on the list is crossed out. So Nicianus's name is crossed out. And it just creates this amazing question. Did Nicianus manage to prove his innocence, or is Nicianus the thief? And his name has been obliterated from the list as a sort of symbol of obliteration, as is the thief. I like to think he's probably the thief. But I also quite like this idea that Sylvester's basically carrying, Savandus is carrying this list around, ticking people off it when he's proved their innocence as well. So again, it's a wonderful bit of human nature that we recognise in ourselves today, I think. So it's fantastic. I suspect time's going on, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. So, of course, that you could buy stuff, you could live in Leicester, you could be ruled by your ruling elite. You've also got to be entertained in Leicester. And we do have evidence of a Roman theatre, we think, recently discovered in Leicester. We've got these 2 large areas of curving wall that we think is the curving wall that would have supported the seats of a Roman theatre, that would have looked very similar to this reconstruction drawing of the one at St Albans. We also have evidence of sort of other entertainment. We've got this recognition from things like the Cyparissus pavement that people appreciated Roman culture. We've got wall paintings that show Roman theatrical masks. We've got glassware that shows popular gladiatorial scenes on them. We've got evidence of an actress and a gladiator in Leicester. This little love token on a bit of Roman pottery. It says Veracunda Ludia and Lucius Gladiator. So it's, Ludia is a Latin word for female entertainer, usually used to mean either an actress or a female gladiator. And so it would have been worn on a thong around the neck, probably, from the hole drilled through it. Board games were very popular in the Roman period, and we see that in the town. We get hundreds and hundreds of gaming counters and dice. We get bone musical instruments turning up as well, the sort of thing that you could just whittle with a knife, basically. And we also have, and this, every time we excavate something in Leicester, and this is possibly because we've just excavated so much of it, something new and really exciting and unique turns up. And this is our latest unique discovery. This is a bronze, well, we think it's probably a key handle. So it's got an iron bar going through it, and whatever was on the bottom of it has snapped off. It's about 10 centimeters long, cast bronze, and it shows an incredibly complicated scene of a bearded barbarian being attacked by a lion, sort of running across the top of 4 clean-shaven, naked men or children. And it seems to be what is called a Damnatio ad bestias scene, condemned to the beasts. It's a scene showing a barbarian being in the arena, being fed to the lions. and the people underneath it are probably the sons of the triad, huddled and running around in panic, effectively. So on the face of it, this is a symbol of sort of the worst side of Roman entertainment, if you will, if you took it at face value. But with all Roman art, there are double meanings in all of this, and basically in this, this is a symbol of Rome and its relationship with the non-Roman areas, and the Rome is the lion, and the barbarian and the people, the boys he's trampling on, is Britain, basically. And that's how you can also look at it. This is a sort of symbol of Roman subjugation over its provinces, but unique. Other knife and key handles like this do exist, these cast bronze knife handles, but we've never come across one so complicated. It's a 3D object. You turn it round, it works in every direction. Whoever's composed this scene and created it out of wax before it was cast has had a real appreciation of a 3D figures, and has had to carve 5 human figures plus the lion. And the detail is incredible. You can tell he's a barbarian because he's got a beard. He's wearing trousers, so he's very un-Roman, and he's also wearing sandals. You can see the lion the face of the lion gnawing on the barbarian's sort of neck or ear, and then it wraps round the body so that the tail and the legs are around the back of the barbarian's legs, and you can see on the back his thick sort of Celtic belt as well. And his swept back hair, very Celtic swept back hair as well. So instantly recognizable as a barbarian, basically. Within all of this then, I haven't mentioned the people really, other than I've mentioned individual people, but I haven't mentioned the people as a whole. So outside the town walls, we get to excavate large areas of Roman cemetery around Leicester. So the western, southern and eastern cemeteries, we've excavated, not all of them by any means, but we have over sort of 300 skeletons from Roman Leicester. And we do notice some distinct trends. The western cemetery seems to be the oldest cemetery, and has burials from the late 1st century all the way through to the 4th century, and shows distinctly pagan burial traditions. Whereas the southern and the eastern cemeteries are really only 3rd and 4th century and show very Christian burial traditions. By then, the Roman Empire was Christian, and so we see these very distinct different areas. It's almost as if, as Christianity is introduced, the Christians of the town didn't want to be buried in the pagan cemetery, and so start setting up new cemeteries in other areas of the town. The pagan cemetery, people were being buried with personal items, so many taking their possessions with them. So we get these fantastic surviving pottery vessels and jewelry, bangles, hairpins, necklaces, beads. We get belt buckles, we get one curious jet ring that might even have a Christian symbol, an iota chi symbol carved on it, or it could just be a pretty pattern, to be fair. But it might be a hidden Christian symbol. So it's an early version of the chi-rho symbol, basically. It doesn't have the P that the chi-rho symbol has, it just has 6 lines like this, you can see at the bottom. And it's an overlapping IX for Jesus Christ, the initials in Greek for Jesus Christ. Or it's just a pretty pattern, as I said. All of this data gives us a very good idea of what the town was like as a whole. So we know that the population was probably 50-50 male to female. Child mortality was incredibly high. About 26% of the Roman town died under the age of 15. Young adult mortality was fairly high as well, with women twice as likely to die in young adulthood as men. Usually that's a sign of pre-modern medicine, with women more likely to die in childbirth at that young age. If women survive childbearing years, though, they tend to live longer than men. So about 30% of the population lived over the age of 45, and more women within that bracket than men, effectively. So it's very typical of a pre-modern society, and you see that in medieval cemeteries as well, that sort of ratio of high mortality amongst children and young women, and so forth. Men were on average ranged from 5 foot to 5'10", women 5 foot to 5'4", so not significantly different to us today. Average height for a man in the Roman period was 5'6" in Leicester, and women were 5'3". And we've carried out stable isotope analysis, so we've looked at diet, and it suggests, interestingly, it suggests that Leicester's Roman diet was predominantly low protein and terrestrial based. So they weren't eating a lot of meat, and they weren't eating a lot of seafood, which sort of makes sense when you consider they're in the middle of the country. But it's the complete opposite to medieval Leicester, which was high protein and high seafood. Which is curious, but it shows a distinct change in diet trends, if you will. And we can get all sorts of information from the health of the population, which generally in childhood was very poor. So we get lots of things like impaired growth, scurvy, rickets, anemia amongst children and adults who've survived those illnesses and become adults. We get things like 43% of the population were affected by maxillary sinusitis, which was a chronic sinus infection, probably from living in smoky environments. So it's probably a fairly common thing in pre-modern societies where you're living with wood fires within the your living space. Lung disease, pulmonary disease, about 20% of the population affected. Tuberculosis, about 6% of the population affected by tuberculosis. We've got signs of cancer as well. And 25% of the population managed to break something during their life. So the sort of slips, trips and falls. We've got various soft tissue injuries, dislocations, broken teeth, healed fractures, things people have survived, although we can't rule out in some cases interpersonal violence. We have got one gentleman that has been decapitated, for instance, and then buried. Now that could be a burial rite, but in this instance, it was a pretty horrendous attack, we think, that ended up with a decapitation after 3 attempts to take the head off. So we think it's a murder in this instance. But we also have, on the flip side, we have evidence of surgery in Leicester. One of the skulls from the southern cemetery has a perfect circular hole in it, which is evidence of a trepanation. So we've actually got evidence of a surgeon in Leicester attempting to carry out a surgery procedure. In this instance, the person had a blow to the head, so they're presumably trying to relieve the pressure on the brain, but it doesn't look like they didn't survive either the blow to the head or the surgery. Well, we don't know which one they died from, but they definitely didn't survive the outcome of it, unfortunately. But it's interesting that whilst we get all of this evidence of poor health and illness and disease and trauma, we also get the evidence of the people trying to heal those people. And what we also get is the people that died quickly of the diseases are the people that actually look perfectly healthy. When you see disease on skeletons, it means that these people actually lived with these conditions for a long period of time and fought their diseases. And therefore they've lived long enough for those diseases to physically alter the skeleton. So actually, when we see signs of diseases, these are actually signs of, in some ways, they're signs of positive stories. They're signs of people fighting their ill health, although ultimately it hasn't necessarily helped them in the long term. We also have evidence of incomers to Leicester. So there's a growing body of evidence across Roman Britain of Africans in Britain. So some of them are evidence as soldiers on Hadrian's Wall, for instance. So we have inscriptions to North African soldiers and Ethiopian soldiers, so sub-Saharan African Roman soldiers. We also have evidence from York. We've got physical skeletal evidence of skeletons that have cranial features that suggest they might have African or mixed ancestry, from York, from London, and from Leicester. We've recently discovered 5 graves of young adults in Leicester who all have cranial features that suggest that they are of African or mixed ancestry. In a pilot study, though, 2 of those we've discovered have had British childhoods, so they were born in Britain. So if they are of African or mixed ancestry, they're 2nd generation, so they are truly African Britons, if you will, rather than people that have arrived in Britain from Africa. We have material culture. We've got things like the Anubis plaque. We've got temples to Isis and Serapis in places in Britain. We've got evidence of communication between Leicester and North Africa. We've got this legionary seal of the Third Cyrenician Legion, which is a legion that only ever served in North Africa and the Middle East. So this is a communication between that legion and someone in Britain, basically, for that to have ended up in Britain. So this is really exciting. And it's exciting because Leicester is a very multicultural city, and it's sort of when you're trying to engage a multicultural city with their British history, it's fantastic when you can actually show them that Roman Britain was multicultural as well. It helps create a sense of connection. But it's really exciting because we've never seen this before. And it's just a product of commercial excavation, just happening to excavate the right bit of a right Roman cemetery that has uncovered this brand new evidence. It's, you know, these people have been buried there for 1,500 years, and we've only just discovered it now. So this is really an exciting new avenue of research for us, which again is putting Leicester in the spotlight in Roman Britain, because when you look at the map of where all this other evidence is finding for, it's finding it in York and it's finding it in London, the two principal Roman cities in Britain by the end of the Roman period. And now we're finding it in Leicester, between the two, in that place where everybody's got to go through. So it's the place you would expect to find this evidence, but we've never previously found it. So, but now we're finding it, which is really exciting. It starts moving our story into an area we would expect but have never been able to prove before. So to wrap this up then, I just want to sort of cover what happens in the end of the Roman period. So the 3rd and 4th centuries were a time of significant change in the Roman Empire and in Roman Britain. So the Emperor Septimus Severus, for instance, he reforms the province in the 190s. So at the end of the 2nd century, and he divides it into two: Britannia Superior, governed from London, and Britannia Inferior, governed from York. So Leicester would have been within this new province, northern province of Britannia Inferior. But actually, for some bits of the 3rd century, it wasn't even in the Roman Empire. It was part of the Gallic Empire, which was a successionist state. There was a crisis in the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. It almost collapsed. You had civil war between rival wannabe emperors. You had plague, economic depression, high taxes, barbarian incursions. It almost led the empire to collapse. And it certainly allowed bits of it to break away temporarily, and Britain was one of those places. Britain itself was increasingly under attack from Picts, from the Scots, from Ireland, from Saxons as well, which is why you start seeing towns in this period get town walls and defences added to them. It's clearly no longer the golden age of the 2nd century is over, and it's a more uncertain time in Britain. And then further reforms in the 4th century divide Britain into 4 provinces. It divides it down even further. And so Leicester becomes a city within this new province called Flavia Caesarensis, which technically its capital was Lincoln. Although I do wonder if perhaps Leicester was its capital based on what we're finding. But I just wanted to show this because the way the Roman province in the 4th century split up, Roman Britain was split up in the 4th century between these 4 provinces is important for our understanding of what happens in the post-Roman period. Because if you look at these, you've got Wessex, East Anglia, Mercia and Northumberland. Those classic Anglo-Saxon kingdoms have their origins in the late Roman provinces in Britain and the regional administrative divisions that created them. So Anglo-Saxon England was not a direct imposition on a society that had been abandoned by Romans. It's actually a continuation of Roman society, just with new cultural ideas and incomers coming from a different direction. But actually, the Romanness of the province continues. What we think of Anglo-Saxon England actually is how late Roman England looked as well. And that we don't tend to actually appreciate that because we're so ingrained with this idea of what Roman Britain should look like from things like Hollywood films and Asterix and so forth. And reenactors, when you go to an English heritage place and watch a Roman reenactment, they're all reenacting generally late 1st, 2nd century Roman life, not later Roman life. So was this the end of Roman Leicester? This is usually seen as the time when urban spaces started to decline. and were abandoned as people moved back out into the countryside, and the whole idea of urbanization collapsed with the Roman Empire. But actually, we're not finding that at all in Roman Leicester. So yes, there was another significant change in our Insula 5, our sort of classic insight window into Roman Leicester. That big courtyard house of the 3rd and early 4th century was demolished, or partly demolished. It no longer was being used as a house. And instead, it had a whole series of fairly grotty workshops put into it, and bits of it were demolished. People were burying coins under the floor, so protecting valuables. And on the face of it, you would think, oh, this is evidence of Roman Leicester in decline. But actually, when you think about it, it's not. It's Roman Leicester in a state of change. This is a domestic area of the town turning into an industrial area, which actually means the town must be prospering as the urban area, the industrial areas move out of their traditional areas into new areas. The town is actually just as busy as it has always been. What has happened is the urban elite has perhaps moved out of the courtyard house for their rural villa, but the bulk of the population is still here, and the town is still functioning as it should. And time again, we keep seeing this. And so these workshops, we get a smithy in one room, we get bone pin making workshops in another room. A whole series of rooms become bone pin making workshops, smithy, and so forth. And so this is a thriving commercial quarter. It's definitely not a decline, it's a change. That's how we have to see late Roman Leicester now. We keep trying to avoid words like abandonment and decline, and looking for things like change and actually growth because of all this late industrial activity going on. So what happens in the early 5th century, right at the end of the Roman Roman occupation of Britain? We know that the final Roman troops are pulled out of Britain in 407 AD. And then the British expelled the Roman magistrates from the usurper Constantine III's magistrates from Britain in AD 409. And a couple of years later, the Emperor Honorius tells Britain that it must look to its own defences, at which point Leicester has fully left Roman administration, which basically is the original Brexit. And it has all the same issues that we are currently facing as well. The removal of Britain from the Roman Empire meant that trade with the empire ceased, which meant that the continental coin supply dried up, which meant that the monetary economy collapsed. We then get fractured administration, and then we start getting superfluous skills not being passed on to next generations, and we start losing the ability to make Roman mosaics and build Roman tiles and make Roman sewers and so forth. But that doesn't mean that Britain stopped being Roman. So what seems to have happened in the late Roman period was that the urban dwelling aristocracy abandoned towns for rural estates. They were more secure on rural estates. And so because the wealth left the town, you stopped getting public buildings being maintained. And so that gives the impression that the town is in decline. But actually, when you get to do commercial excavations and you look at sort of the everyday buildings, we see that, as we've seen in Insula 5, Leicester and other Roman towns were still thriving and changing and active. They still had functioning economies, although perhaps it had shifted to more subsistence barter-based economies. They still had large plebeian populations, and they were still maintaining their urban functions of administration, tax collection, trade, defense, etc. And when you actually look at the 5th century in Britain, and the St. Patrick here is really useful. So St. Patrick, the Irish patron saint, he was actually Romano-Briton from Cumbria. His Latin name is Patricius, and he was living in the early to mid 5th century, and his father Calpurnius was one of that ruling urban elite. He was a decurion and deacon in Cumbria. And when you look at St. Patrick's writings of his early life in Britain before he is in Ireland, when he looks back on his life in Britain, comparing it with his life in Ireland, the word he uses for Britain is Romanitas. Everything to do with Britain, in contrast to Ireland, is Romanness. He uses this word Romanitas. And so in the 5th century, after the Romans have left, in the eyes of the Romano-British, they are still Roman. That hasn't changed. It wasn't like the Romans left and instantly everybody reverted back to 350 years to being Iron Age. They were still Roman, they just weren't under Roman administration. And actually, how long that continued is a big question, and I don't have an answer for it. What we do know is that we don't see any material cultural change until the mid to late 5th century, when we start seeing distinctive Anglo-Saxon fashions appearing. But what we're generally seeing in Leicester is that we don't get a break in occupation. We get a continuation of occupation all the way through from the Iron Age into the Roman period, into the Anglo-Saxon period, where the town is continuously maintaining itself. And we have one final clue to the fact that at the end of the Roman Empire in Britain, Roman Leicester at least, and I'm sure this is the same in all other Roman towns, was still firmly in control of its own destiny, if you will. It was still maintaining itself, still had officials and administrators and soldiers protecting itself. And we see that with one final object. So this was a grave from the Western Cemetery. It is of a middle-aged man. So he was in his late 30s or early 40s when he died. He died probably from his radiocarbon date in the very early 5th century AD. So right at the end of the Roman administration in Britain, maybe even died slightly later than that as well. So radiocarbon dates are a little bit tricky in this period. The attributes on his skeleton and what he was buried with give us a very unique insight into who this individual was. So he had suffered quite a hard life. He'd got a healed fracture to his left forearm, which was a defensive or parry injury. He'd damaged his left wrist joint as well, which would have left his wrist permanently weakened as well. He'd also damaged the muscles in his right upper arm and shoulder, sort of through overuse and overextension. And those are quite distinctive injuries. He'd survived all those, though. What he probably died from was an infection from an abscess in his teeth, in his jaw. He was also buried with this copper object next to his waist. Now, the types of injuries that he was exhibiting are the same sort of injuries you would see in a sportsman throwing things and putting your arm out to protect yourself from something, which when you combine them together and make them a Roman, tells us that he's almost certainly a Roman soldier. So he's broken his shield arm and he's overextended his weapon arm, basically. And actually, that is exactly what a late Roman soldier would do, because late Roman soldiers, rather than throwing javelins, threw throwing darts. And that's the same sort of motion that you'd, as I learnt from experience, it hurts if you overthrow one of them. So we know this gentleman is a Roman soldier, but then what he was buried with was an incredibly elaborate belt buckle and belt set. Now, in the late Roman army, the belt was your rank insignia, basically. And from the more elaborate the belt, the higher ranked you were. And this is as elaborate a belt as you can get. In fact, I only can think of one other example of a belt like this in Britain, and it's from London, a cemetery in London. All other examples are not this elaborate. So we've got a strap end here. So this was the end of the strap, the leather strap, and you've got these two lovely little dogs crouched, running down the side of the strap. And then the strap would have fed through the belt buckle, and it'd be a big thick belt, sort of like a wrestler's belt effectively with this. So this is the thickness of the actual belt. It's about 10 centimeters thick. And it's in a style called chip carved style. So it's actually a cast object here, but it's imitating carved woodwork. And it's a very distinctive German style. So this is when in the late Roman Empire, in the army of the late Roman Empire, is largely dominated by German tribes that have moved south into and been co-opted into the Roman Empire. And so their art styles start to really dominate within the Roman army. So this is a late Roman soldier who is wearing a very elaborate belt buckle and is buried with it, which probably means he was still active service, either as a high-ranking soldier or as some sort of civil servant when he died. There was an expression in the late Roman period for taking up public service as putting on the belt, and when you retired, you took off the belt. There was a Latin phrase that sort of roughly translates like that. So the fact that he's buried in the very end of the Roman Leicester and is buried as a Roman official suggests that he is still doing his job and the town is still functioning as it should. But I just have one final observation with this, because I keep saying that late Romans, and this late Roman soldier here, you could sort of think perhaps looks like an Anglo-Saxon in terms of his clothing, his armour, his weapons, and his art style. Because this chip carved style that you see here in the late Roman period continues to evolve in the post-Roman period into its ultimate expression, which is the Sutton Hoo classic Anglo-Saxon art styles. This is the ultimate end of this beginning, and this is the beginning of this art style that ends with the Sutton Hoo treasures. And here's on the left you can see an intermittent early Anglo-Saxon style of belt buckle, very similar to a late Roman belt buckle. And so the more we excavate, the more we realise that Roman Leicester never stopped being Roman Leicester. It just slowly evolved into Anglo-Saxon Leicester, and then into medieval Leicester, and then into the city that is the present day. There's not been any break in continuity in the story. It's been a city, and I proudly claim this, it's been a city for over 2,000 years, which makes it older than London. So it is because of that unique insight that we get into a city that has been continuously occupied, because of the quirks in Leicester's urban topography that allows us access in large excavations into the urban core. Leicester is the perfect city, in effect, to study how cities actually evolved in Britain in general. And we're still going. And actually, this was really just the first half of the story, effectively, because, as I keep saying, it carries on going to the present day. There's so much evidence from Leicester that you can't get it in one talk. And this is not me trying to say you should invite me back, but it's just, there is so much archaeology in Leicester, and the beauty is we get to dig it, which you just don't get to do in cities like Lincoln and York and Canterbury, and even to some extent in London itself. Whilst there's a huge amount of excavation in London, they don't often get to look at areas of the city on the same scale that we do, which just makes Leicester really special archaeologically speaking. Anyway, thank you for listening. I didn't have a clock with me, so I don't know what time it is at this point, but anyway, thank you very much for listening.